Last week we talked about the beginning of the end of rent control, the history of rent control, and how it led to the initiative petition that ultimately brought rent control to a conclusion. Tonight we resume that discussion, and let me take things up again with Denise Jillson. Denise, you were the president of the Cambridge Small Property Association. At one point, you helped organize the political effort that ended rent control. Why and how did you come about turning to the strategy of a statewide referenda to deal with what you believe to have been egregious wrongs of the rent control system?
Well, as we spoke about last week, it was John Maddox that came to me in May of 1993 with the suggestion, and we had tried a lot of different things. I think it's interesting to note that the first, SPOGA was around since 1987. We were now in 1993. We had tried to appeal to the Cambridge City Council. We picketed every Monday night for, a couple of years in a row. We attended every Wednesday religiously the public hearings at the Rent Board. We tried the legislative process only to have bills submitted and killed in committee. We attempted a constitutional lawsuit. Right, yeah. Yes, Sandra took care of that. Thank you so much. And we, had a constitutional lawsuit. So when the idea of the initiative petition came up, we just said, oh, sure, go ahead, we can do that. Not understanding at all what it meant or what it involved. But nonetheless, John had an idea that he could probably get the language together and submit it. And you have to remember that this was, the end of May of '93, and we had to submit it sometime in probably mid-June or July, early July, to be accepted for the next year. And, nobody was more surprised than I when we got word that it was going on the ballot.
Now, Bob Moncrieff has written the history of the end of rent control in Massachusetts in an article that appears in the New England Journal of Public Policy. John Maddox originated a concept which he took to the Attorney General's office and had to revise.
It's legally a little complicated, and maybe this isn't the right forum to talk about it, but the fact of the matter is what the Attorney General said is you can't abolish rent control by initiative petition because there are only 7 communities involved, and you can't use the referendum or the initiative petition for such local effect. Most of the cities and towns are not affected by this. So John, being an imaginative fellow, said that he would draft something that gave everybody the right to have rent control, but not much rent control. And I think it was 90 days, and during that period the city had to make up the difference between the rent-controlled rent and the market rents, and it was nothing. It was really nothing.
Basically would have required the city to come up with the money to make up the difference for landlords.
You knew no city or town was ever going to adopt it. It was absolutely unresponsive. Yeah. But the Attorney General was broad-minded about it. He said, well, look, this has statewide effect, affects everybody. So it's okay. We'll put it on the ballot.
Now, this began the first...
And of course, that process of approving a question...
And I don't think he won governorship, did he?
No, but that begins...
I'm talking about Bellotti.
The process, yeah, but the process there is before the high requirement of the high number of signatures that one has to get. So there's an awful lot of initiative petitions that never meet that threshold that get
I'm sure
okay.
that
staggering.
Sachs never said this to me in the Attorney General's office.
This is Peter
but
Sachs,
I think there are 2 things. One is I think the Attorney General's attitude is that he's very liberal about putting things, about okaying them. If the people don't want to vote for him, they won't vote for him, and maybe the court will throw him out. But we're not going to stop things at this administrative level. And the other thing, on 90% or 95% of the initiative petitions, they never get the signatures.
Yeah. That's right.
There was a high-profile one just a year or 2 ago that Joe Malone was involved in, I forget. They didn't even do 20,000. Yeah. And you filed 90?
Yeah.
In the end.
So this first approval by the Attorney General was, again, the first in a series of close calls and near misses. Yeah. You had the getting the Attorney General to approve your petition took longer than you thought. You had to withstand a court challenge to the Attorney General's approval.
That's right.
And while that was going on, you had to gather 90,000 signatures. You had to gather...
Well, no, the course of events, in credit to Peter Sachs, too, because, what people don't understand is that the
He was a rent-controlled tenant.
Well, he was a rent-controlled tenant, former rent-controlled tenant in Cambridge. Yeah, mid-Cambridge. And he believed in it, by the way. But you know, part of their job is to act as an advocacy group for the people, if you will, and to make sure that the language is somewhat constitutional. And to his credit, there was a lot of correspondence between myself, John Maddox, and Peter Sachs in making sure that the language was acceptable. So we worked very hard on that and felt fairly confident once we got the approval that it was going to be okay. And then, of course, you know, we were about 300 and some odd signatures short of certified signatures.
You turned in a whole bunch of signatures. Some of them were tossed out, which brought you below the approval level.
Just about 300.
Denise, tell them a little bit about how this started. I mean, you have about 9 weeks, basically, by the time you get the petitions before you have to send them to the city.
I can tell you how it started.
It started on Labor Day. By the middle of October, they had 4,000 signatures. I mean, and everybody figured it was a ball game was over.
Well, it first started with, you know, a phone call saying, come and pick up all these blanks. So my husband went to pick them up, and he brought them home on a Friday night, and it was hot, and the kids were hungry, and he had them in the kitchen. And he said, you know, what do we do now? And the kids are like, Mom, what's for dinner? But, you know...
You should ask your father.
But we needed to set up an office. We needed to, you know, set up a campaign. We had no money, none at all. And couldn't take any of SPOA's money because that would have been illegal. We had to set up a ballot question committee. We had to determine a name, one that was effective. We needed a campaign strategy. All of these things had to be done in very short order. But the most important pressing matter was getting out there and getting the signatures. And you know, it's not rocket science. Basically, it's hard work. Yeah. And that's all it is. It's a lot of
you know,
hard work.
I always thought it was unfair that it went on the ballot because it did only affect certain people. And you know, when I was in the legislature, they used to say to me, Saundra, the first time we get an opportunity to vote rent control out, we are going to jam it down your throat. So to allow them to let it go on a statewide ballot, I thought was wrong because it should have been an initiative petition in the city of Cambridge to do that.
But the Supreme Judicial Court ultimately vindicated the position of the Attorney General in an argument that was developed in part with the collaboration of Charles Freed, who's at the Harvard Law School.
Well, the interesting thing is they vindicated the conclusion of the Attorney General, but they did not vindicate the Attorney General's logic. They said, and I think Freed did have a lot to do with this, but it was a very, very tough case because this rent control that had been invented and that Sachs had approved was really an illusion.
It was
Freed said that's not the issue. That rent control is a statewide issue. Just by its nature.
With an impact on contiguous communities
But he gave them a logic.
And his future colleagues sustained him overwhelmingly.
Unanimously, wasn't it?
Well, you know, I think all of it was wrong, and I think their money played a big part in this. You know, friends have friends have friends have friends.
But let me just say
they should have never put it on the initiative petition to go statewide. It wasn't anybody's business but ours.
I would argue, Saundra, was taking the road less traveled, the harder road, the more difficult. There were 9 ballot questions that year. Right off the bat, you run the risk, particularly when you are still a relatively unfunded group compared to the other. Question 2, which the unions were supporting, I mean, millions of dollars. It was a trifling amount of money. You had 9, which is a lot. There is a tendency on the part of people to vote no if they don't understand the question. You're up against that. And then add to that the mentality that was easily, and it was that the promoters were that the opponents of 9 were using, which was, look, you may think the system is bad economics. You might even think it's illogical or immoral, but it's our business. It's Cambridge. Leave us alone. You had to fight that. So the statewide ballot access or initiative, in my opinion, was absolutely the most difficult, challenging way to go about
in fact,
this.
You know, we didn't, you know, there was no state law or no judgment to put it on the ballot. I mean, you just had to get signatures from the people of Cambridge, initiative petition from the city of Cambridge to get it on the ballot. And you could have had a local petition and let the people do that. But you didn't win. And that's what it's supposed to be.
Well, that's why
but why should the state allow other people in other towns to do it?
Politically, the only way to get it was to go to the state.
I know how they got it, because I know.
Judicial Court
What was
got
the
off
law?
on
Who was the lobbyist at Bill Delaney? I mean, he used to stay on my tail all the time. He says I could take rent control.
So
you know?
now,
but
you know, from a public policy,
they shouldn't be allowed to vote. And the reason it never got through committee because it went to local affairs. And that's where it should be, in local affairs. And fortunately, we had enough people to kill it.
See, look at
you know, so it's fair.
Yeah, and it's still for you.
Wait a second. The House never got to vote on it or debate on it.
Conservatives had enough power, they would have passed.
Look at
we did. So no.
Look, I have the greatest, as a practicing trial, I have the greatest faith in the juries of the Commonwealth that they come out with the right answer. I don't have a similar confidence in the legislature, and never have. I will say this, though.
Unfortunately, I think the opposite, because I don't think the justice system in this country works.
I think it works just fine. And when we start electing judges, maybe I'll have more confidence in what they do.
Oh my God, that's worse.
But from a public policy perspective, I think you have two things going on here. One is I think it is fundamental and universally held that referendum is the worst form of legislation, and it is only, I mean, California notwithstanding, it is the respite of desperate people. And that's what happened here, was that a bunch of desperate people were created by the fundamental unfairness. The second thing I think at work here, which drove these people to this desperation, was the unabated tyranny of the majority over the minority. Why should the minority who owned property support these unacknowledged wealthy people? 1/3 of the people living in rent-controlled apartments were now wealthy individuals. So why? So these desperate people had no way out. They were forced into the worst place, which was a referendum. And all the rest of them were working-class people. And you know who suffered? Everybody suffers, because
everybody suffers now.
Now, the people who are desperate, a small band of driven people, can say, we can seek a wider audience. And I mean, I think that's part of the thesis of your article is...
I mean, and that's why you see families moving out every day, moving into Somerville, moving into Malden, moving into Everett, just moving out of the city, because the rents have gone up so high that they can't afford to live here. So you're going to have a class city, the very rich and the very poor.
It's sad to see.
And that's the kind of city you're going to have.
It is sad to see families leave. But I've also seen a lot of long-term Cambridge residents, particularly through my church, who've left Cambridge, and it was happening during rent control, because what would happen was the 2 or 3 family house, there was a low rent, that the owner might have died, and the children sold it, and the new owner had to make the kind of income to, to cover his mortgage, and the rates would rise. So there was a fair amount of displacement going on. What would be interesting to do is to find out how many of not the tenants that have left Cambridge, but of the tenant activists, and how many of them have become not homeowners, but landlords.
We'll get to that
in other
the
communities.
Recrimination section of this discussion before we
we
go.
get to that?
But let's
trying to say one thing that I think Saundra touched on it. Part of the mantra is that this was all bought by the real estate industry, and I think it's plain that the real estate industry, at least in the latter stages of the campaign, probably contributed $0.75 of the dollars, although at the beginning they didn't. But anybody who thinks that this was a bought and sold deal doesn't understand what happened.
No, because first of all, well, second or third of all, you got on the ballot by how many signatures?
34.
34.
Yeah. But these people collected almost 90,000. They had 70,000 certified in a period of 9 weeks, and they did it fundamentally based in Cambridge because they were deeply troubled by what they regarded as condescending indifference to their affairs by the rent control establishment here.
The rent control
it was a very, very strongly felt feeling that they were being sneered at.
In fact, among those who might be targets of recriminations may have been the staff of the rent control department, who were notoriously obnoxious.
They loved that. The students, they call them.
Yes.
Aside from the validity of the program and the people that rent control helped over the years, the staff of the rent control board did not particularly help in the long run preserve the program. Now, you made some strategic decisions as the campaign got going. You made a decision to keep it positive.
Absolutely.
Because you wanted people to have something they could feel good about voting for.
That's right.
You could have made this a let's screw Cambridge petition.
Could have.
You could have taken the mayor of Cambridge,
Well, what the hell was it?
Who had,
For Christ's
who had,
sake, what was Fred Myers? I mean, come on.
But you could have taken the mayor of Cambridge, who had a rent control department, and hung him out to dry publicly, and even played the hate card, and probably done better than you did in the election by pulling those negatives up. But you made a decision to keep it positive.
Yes, we did.
Now, you probably don't regret that decision now, but few days before the election when it looked like it could go.
It always felt right to me, and that was the most important thing. I had to feel good about what I was doing because being the spokesperson for the campaign and making an awful lot of the decisions through consensus management with some of the other players, it was really important that I felt good about the campaign and about the message.
Also, you know, in fairness, Denise, I'm sure what you say is true, but this was the political advice you were getting from Dyer.
Absolutely, and you know
Dyer
something?
said that people on initiative petitions, I mean, you know, most of the people who vote didn't have the same experiences that these people had had. And you had to give them something that they felt good about. So the line was, the story was, this is a well-intentioned social program that's benefiting rich tenants at the expense of struggling landlords, and you can end this injustice by voting yes.
But you knew that men would view this differently from women
Yes, we
as
did.
well.
Well, you know, I mean, this was a very well-run campaign. From the very beginning, Dennis Dyer had contacted me and said, you know, I'd like to do this for you. And I, you know, didn't take his phone calls because I didn't have any money and I didn't know how I was going to hire him. And he worked, to his credit, he worked for months without getting any money at all. With the agreement, the verbal agreement from me that said, yeah, if we get on the ballot, if we go forward, you can handle the campaign. And he had a strategy planned from the very beginning. In my first meeting with him, which was August of 1993, he said to me, you're going to have two battles. The first one will be the ballot box, and the second one will be the legislature. He knew through experience that initiative petitions that win ultimately will compromise. So we were fully prepared for that.
Now,
You didn't do television, did you?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, we had,
Sure
we had.
Barbara
we had-
Pilgrim was
Barbara
on.
Pilgrim,
Yeah.
Mrs.
But
Petrillo.
it wasn't
Yeah,
very
Mrs.
much,
Petrillo.
given that
No.
there was it
No,
was
it
drowned
had-
out by the other questions in the governor's race, right?
And the other
expensive.
piece of the rent control that you didn't talk about,
I never saw it.
it was sad because the city had an opportunity to really put together a decent housing policy, and they didn't, because they dwelled on rent control as the cure-all and never dealt with a decent
Well, they
housing
had the
policy
narcotic.
to keep people in the city of Cambridge. And that's where I used to fight all the time, but never could get past the rent control issue.
See, now there was an opportunity for this, for that kind of discussion, to really
Right.
formulate a policy
right.
and not continue to use rent control as the Cambridge equivalent
That's
of
right.
abortion.
Absolutely.
That you were either for it, against
No,
it,
I
there was
would-
no middle ground.
I would-
No, and that opportunity, for those who remember, was as a result of the candidacies of Geneva Malenfant, Hugh Russell, and then Karen Swain. They offered the liberal alternative to rent control. Between the three of them, they got 1,000 votes. There was no support within the liberal community for any dialogue about a housing policy.
Because
we tried
prior to
all
the-
the time, and
prior
we could
to
never
this,
get a decent housing policy.
any candidate who is willing to discuss meaningfully modifications of rent control could not get a Cambridge Civic Association endorsement, therefore could not get on the
tenants union
the
endorsement.
tenant slate card, and would not be able to get the transfer votes
That's right.
necessary to continue to increase their vote total and make it to what we call quota here. You also made a decision to pick certain themes and repeat them over and over again.
That's right.
It's an interesting tactic. We saw that with President Clinton in 1996. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, and education and the environment, or Medicare, Social Security, education, and the environment. What were you doing upstairs with Paula Jones? That's irrelevant. Medicare, Social Security,
They
education,
learned
and the
that from
environment.
Ed King.
It was important that we, we had such a small,
Consistent
such a small amount of time. I think Dennis told us that you have probably about 15 seconds to state your
Absolutely.
case, and you didn't have any more than that.
Reagan was
In our group of volunteers were just so interested in educating the public about rent control that was probably the most difficult thing that we needed to
Now
do.
comes election day,
Yep.
and you win by 1%.
Yep.
It's a narrow victory, but that is not the end of it,
No, it's
because
not.
the legislature will entertain ameliorating legislation to ease the impact.
And the governor, who set a record by winning 72% of the vote, said a week earlier, I will read the petition when I get into the ballot box. It turns out that he may have hid his true feelings with that statement.
It's interesting about Governor Weld, because I had met with him prior to his even becoming governor. It was probably 1990. September of 90, David Sullivan and I and John Natale were invited.
This is a different David Sullivan.
This is our David Sullivan.
From the Small Property Owners Association.
As opposed to the other David Sullivan. We met with Governor Weld at his house, and he wasn't governor yet, and he, you know, was very sympathetic, and he said, you know, this is a political hot potato, and it's going to be very difficult for any politician to come out and really take a stand. However, if you give me the opportunity at some point in time that will enable me to help you, then I promise you I will help you.
So the governor makes it clear.
In 1990.
And even House Speaker Charles Flaherty had made it clear to the Cambridge delegation that now that you're looking for ameliorating legislation, if you want to see something pass and get enacted into law, it had better meet certain criteria. It better be a phase out. It had better have protections for those in greatest social and economic need. It had better come to us with more than a 5-4 vote of the Cambridge City Council. Now the Cambridge City Council sees an opportunity to send to the legislature a home rule petition to ameliorate the impact of this recently elected referendum.
Overrule it.
Whatever it was, that for me was one of the most telling episodes in the history of Cambridge politics, because watching the hearings as I did, both in person with my camera and tape recorder and on local television as well, what I saw was a celebration of narcissistic advocates' personality disorder like you've never seen. I don't
know if that's in the DSM-4.
Well, no, it's a DSM-4A. I saw, and again, please contradict me. I always watch the way in a public hearing, the number of times a speaker will use the word I in the first 60 seconds of an address. People coming up as as's, you know, as a tenant, as a this, I say this and I say that. And some of the most zealous tenant leaders refusing to compromise, refusing to see the message that the governor had sent, and demanding that the same city councilors whom they'd had by the throat for 25 years sit there almost in panic, because suddenly the governor wasn't going to sign anything that Denise Jillson didn't like. Yeah. That must have been, I mean, other than that, maybe even better than the birth of your children.
Well, in fairness, the city council did pass a home rule petition that was responsive to what Flaherty had said, and 6 of the city councilors voted for it. But it went further than Denise Jillson was prepared to go. It protected too many people for too long a time.
And the governor wouldn't sign?
So it only passed the Senate by 1 vote, and the governor vetoed it. But they did finally get ameliorated
There was an amelioration bill that actually passed down the stretch, and a lot of work went into that behind the scenes.
That's right, it had to. You know, we were dealing with a lot of issues, but primarily we were dealing with the governor being very specific, and also we had, you know, we were still at the Supreme Court, and we were getting very clear messages from the Supreme Court that, look, we will hold this.
Actually, let me explain why. There was a challenge to the legitimacy of the election itself, because the full text of the question and even a summary was alleged not to have appeared in ballot boxes where people went to vote. So a single justice of the Supreme Judicial Court, Justice Wilkins, who is now the Chief Justice, was not at the time, had the case under advisement. He seemed not to want to deal with the issue while the legislature was considering the bill.
That's right.
Is that prudent course?
And we were getting messages, clear messages from the court.
That's because Frank Sargent appointed Wilkins. If Dukakis had appointed the judge in question, maybe it would have been different.
One other piece of data you should know is the Senate President, Bill Bulger, was pro-rent control.
Yes.
So the fact that it survived by 1 vote in the Senate, with the Senate President's public statements in favor of rent control, he had always been in favor of rent control, both in Boston and in Cambridge.
Yeah, another Senate President, and that may not have even made it through the Senate, that bill.
So it's still, even with the Senate President's strong support, only survived by 1 ballot.
So a lot of people who might never have had a decent thing to say about Bill Bulger might might be rethinking some of their statements.
Well, I still think he's a great man despite his report of rent control.
Bill Folger did some good stuff. The ideology is different, but he did some good stuff.
Let's talk about the SPOA people. How together were the SPOA people during the discussion of the?
I had, full support, I think, of our rank and file. Unfortunately, it was a difficult decision for me to continue to work with the lobbyists, the attorneys, with the legislature, and having to do that in executive committee, if you will. Through the campaign, I tried to communicate, every Sunday night religiously. We would have meetings and, bring to the table everything that was happening so that everybody was on board, everybody was informed. Anybody that wanted to come to the meeting could come. But this was a time, the time between, November and January, when it was very, very difficult because it was so sensitive and so critical that it wasn't easy, and I could not discuss it outside of the committee.
Also, it's important to point out the type of environment you were operating in. If anyone's watched legislation or lobbied, you know that in the closing days of the legislature, they're in session almost nonstop the last 2-3 days. All of the parties on all different sides of an issue are huddled in the hallway waiting for your 5 minutes when they come out of the chamber and listen to you. You've got to think quick, say that, and they're going back in, and if you haven't worked your thing out, they're going to take out the bill after you and the bill after that, and maybe you'll never get done. So you don't control not only the circumstances, but even the agenda, the amount of time you get, when it gets taken up on the calendar.
Time was a factor. We were looking at 3 home rule petitions. We were trying to pull it all together. We wanted something that was cohesive. The holidays were coming. It was intense. It was great fun.
And the other side
it was amazing
that
fun.
well organized either.
No, actually, as Bill Cunningham has pointed out in his booklet, and I
That's
think
right.
people that may be
They were
interested
not
in
that
that
well
can
organized.
call him on Kirkland Street and see if there are copies available. The tenants were unable to get together to keep a unified campaign going. They were starved for money.
There was, of course, an ameliorative bill finally passed and signed. It gave 2 years protection to certain limited numbers of tenants. One thing that I think it's important to know, these tenants who had so-called protective status were allowed to register with the Rent Control Board. And the number of units in Cambridge, rent-controlled units, that registered never reached 10%.
Well, and the interesting...
And the way that study had been trashed only a couple of years earlier than
Gertzer was a great report, and I felt very comfortable going across the state using the stats.
It was a report that said that few tenants...
90%. The figure that I used when I was out there in junior high school auditoriums and American Legions were 90% of the people that were residing in rent-controlled apartments would never, ever qualify for a subsidy. And when it came out to be 93%, certainly we felt vindicated.
In the real numbers now, the numbers fluctuated from maybe as high as at one time 22,000 units, but it seemed to settle somewhere around 17,000 units seemed to be regulated. 1,500 people or less applied for protected status.
One question that we'll have to save for the discussion of the local election, which is approaching as we actually air and tape this program for the first time, is the impact that the demise of rent control will have on the body politic. We've run out of time, we can't do it now, but before Election Day you'll be hearing a lot about what the demise of rent control may mean to the local elected bodies that we'll be selecting in November. With that, thanks to Bob Moncrieff for writing the piece, Denise Jillson for appearing with us. We'll see you next week on Cambridge Inside Out.